The sun dies slowly over the New Mexico desert, spilling copper light across a horizon of bone-dry mesas. Wind scours the sand, rattling mesquite branches like old bones. A faint hum of insects fills the silence. The kind of stillness that feels ancient, older than roads, older than towns. Now picture the flicker of a handheld camera. News footage, a shaky shot of a modest ranch house miles from the nearest gas station. A reporter's voice cuts through the static. Tonight, a story out of Lincoln County that sounds impossible. A 7-year-old boy who claims he is the reincarnation of the legendary outlaw, Billy the Kid. Cut to the boy himself. Ethan Ward. Freckles across the bridge of his nose, hair the color of late-harvest wheat. He sits on the edge of a worn leather couch, small boots dangling above the carpet. He looks straight at the camera with eyes that don't flinch. "I was Billy the Kid," he says, the words calm, not a trace of rehearsal, no giggle, no nervous glance toward his parents. Just a quiet certainty as if he's stating the day of the week. The air in the room seems to contract. His mother, Claire, folds her arms tight. His father, Mark, tries to smile but can't quite manage. Behind them, a muted television flashes the evening weather, but no one notices. Ethan continues, voice soft yet oddly sure. He names places that hang in the air like ghost towns from another century: Fort Sumner, Stinking Springs, Mesilla. He speaks of men called Pat Garrett and Charlie Bodra, names most adults would have to Google. Claire's eyes well with a confusion that borders on fear. Mark clears his throat, but no words come, because there is no simple explanation for how a first grader from Albuquerque could rattle off the itinerary of a 19th century outlaw. The camera cuts again. A grainy black and white photo of Billy the Kid flashes across the screen. The infamous tintype showing a skinny young man in a rumpled hat, rifle across his chest, a crooked grin that taunts history. The caption reads, "Killed, July 14th, 1881. That was 144 years ago. Historians agree Billy the Kid died at the age of 21, shot by Sheriff Pat Garrett. But young Ethan claims the history books are only half right. He says he remembers the shootouts, the jailbreaks, even the smell of the desert night." Cut back to the living room. Ethan swings his feet, still unblinking. "They said Pat shot me," he murmurs. "But that's not how it happened. I remember everything." The words land heavy. Somewhere outside, a coyote howls as if on cue. The screen fades to black for a heartbeat. Then the low thrum of an old acoustic guitar creeps in, a single note that sounds like a warning. Most children spin stories. Some have vivid dreams. But what do you do when your child tells you a truth no child should know? A truth that reaches across lifetimes. Images flash. The ruins of Fort Sumner under a harvest moon. Weather-worn wanted posters. The cracked stone of an unmarked grave. Is it imagination, coincidence, or something far stranger? Proof that the frontier between life and death is thinner than we think. The music swells, a heartbeat drum echoing like hooves across a canyon. "Back to the Ward family," Claire whispers to her husband almost off mic. "How could he know those names? We've never even..." She stops, realizing the camera is still rolling. Mark rubs his forehead. A man caught between disbelief and dawning dread. Ethan sits perfectly still. Outside, the desert wind picks up, carrying dust across the porch like the breath of another age. The reporter steps forward, his voice low. When we asked Ethan how he learned about Billy the Kid, he didn't hesitate. "I didn't learn it," he said. "I remember it." The screen fades once more, leaving only the hiss of desert wind. 3 years before the cameras arrived, before strangers parked at the edge of the Ward family's gravel driveway, Ethan was only 4. A preschooler with a mop of blonde hair and the kind of quiet confidence that sometimes unsettles adults. Back then, nothing about him seemed extraordinary. He liked peanut butter sandwiches, plastic dinosaurs, and bedtime stories about rocket ships. Yet tiny cracks in the ordinary began to show, like hairline fractures spreading across glass. It started with his drawings. Most kids in his class sketched stick-figure families or bright rainbows. Ethan filled sheet after sheet with sepia-toned landscapes made from dull brown crayons. His teacher, Ms. Ramirez, saved the first one because it looked so oddly specific. A long, Dusty street flanked by wooden storefronts, a saloon with swinging doors, a sheriff's office with iron bars drawn carefully across a single window. When she asked what it was, Ethan didn't hesitate. "Lincoln," he said matter-of-factly, pronouncing the word with a faint twang. "Is that where your grandparents live?" she asked. "No," he replied, head bent over the paper. "That's where I broke out." At the time, Ms. Ramirez assumed he'd misheard a story from television. She mentioned it to Claire at pickup, laughing it off. But Claire felt a flicker of unease she couldn't name. Soon came the language, phrases no one in their household used. One afternoon, while building block towers, Ethan looked up and said, "That'll fetch a pretty penny." Another time he complained that a snack was plumb dry. Mark teased him gently, "Where'd you learn to talk like an old cowboy?" Ethan shrugged. "I always talked this way. Folks back in the territory did too." Night brought stranger signs. Ethan began waking from vivid dreams, sometimes crying, sometimes eerily calm. He described narrow jail cells, moonlit deserts, the metallic taste of gunpowder. "I can smell the horses," he whispered once to his mother as she tucked him back in. "They get nervous before a fight." Claire told herself children have wild imaginations. But a knot tightened in her stomach every time his small hands mimed cocking a revolver he'd never seen. The details grew sharper. During a family movie night, an animated film, nothing Western, Ethan announced that a man named Pat was coming for him. "Pat Garrett," he clarified when his parents exchanged puzzled looks. Neither Claire nor Mark recognized the name. Later, a quick search revealed the famous sheriff who gunned down Billy the Kid. They said nothing to Ethan, certain he'd forget, but he didn't. At the grocery store, he gravitated toward the magazine rack and traced his finger over an Old West photo on a history cover. "That rifle's wrong," he muttered. "Should be a Winchester 73. When Mark asked how he knew, Ethan replied with quiet certainty, "Because that's the one I carried." Friends and relatives offered easy explanations. Kids absorbed things from cartoons, from overheard conversations, from random YouTube clips. Yet neither parent could recall any Western shows or books in their home. They lived in suburban Albuquerque, surrounded by modern sprawl, not dusty legends. Then came the road trip incident that cemented their unease. On a drive to visit Claire's sister near Santa Rosa, Ethan piped up from the back seat. "You're going the wrong way," he said, eyes fixed on the endless highway. "We need to head toward Fort Sumner." Mark asked why. "That's where my grave is," the boy answered. As if pointing out a rest stop, Mark laughed it off. But Claire felt the chill of those words long after the car ride ended. By late autumn, the small oddities had stacked into something undeniable. Ethan played an elaborate game with neighborhood kids, reenacting gunfights and jailbreaks with an accuracy too precise for a preschooler. He'd correct them on how to hold a six-shooter or how to knot a bandana for a quick getaway. When another child teased him, "You're not a real cowboy," Ethan's face darkened with an emotion far older than 4 years. "I'm not a cowboy," he said evenly. "I'm Billy." Claire tried a different tactic, gentle questioning before bedtime, hoping to untangle fantasy from fact. "Who is Billy?" she asked. "I am," Ethan answered without pause. "I was before. The word hung in the dim nightlight glow. Each conversation deepened the mystery. He spoke of riding across the Pecos under a blood-red sky, of partners named Charlie and Dave, of stealing horses and laughing as bullets ricocheted off canyon walls. When Claire pressed for where he'd heard these stories, he simply said, "I remember." By winter, Mark began keeping a private journal of every strange comment, every name or place Ethan mentioned. He highlighted Lincoln, Fort Sumner, Pat Garrett, Charlie Boda, Stinking Springs. Later, he'd discover every one of those names belonged to real people and real places tied to Billy the Kid. Still, they clung to rational explanations. Maybe Ethan had overheard something at preschool, or absorbed facts from a background TV documentary. Maybe it was all coincidence, the pattern-seeking mind of worried parents. But the coincidences kept piling up. One chilly January evening, Ethan woke screaming, convinced someone was standing at his bedroom door. When Claire rushed in, he grabbed her arm and whispered, "Pat's here. He found me." His small body shook as though he'd truly fled through a century of time. Claire and Mark exchanged a silent look over their son's head. An unspoken question passing between them. What if this isn't just a phase? The next morning, Ethan was cheerful, eating cereal as though nothing had happened. Yet when Claire asked if he remembered the nightmare, he nodded solemnly. "It's not a nightmare," he said. "It's a memory." The Ward household grew heavy with questions no parent expects to face. What do you do when your child speaks of a life he should never know? How long before curiosity turns to fear? These were only the first tremors. The real earthquake, the proof no one could explain, was waiting just beyond the horizon. The late spring sky was the color of hammered pewter when the Wards packed their SUV for a weekend trip to visit Claire's sister near Santa Rosa. The drive promised nothing more exciting than scrubland. A few gas station snacks and the gentle rhythm of highway miles. But 40 minutes outside Albuquerque, Ethan lifted his head from a coloring book and spoke with that quiet authority his parents had learned to recognize. "We need to turn south," he said. Mark glanced at the GPS. "South? We're headed east, buddy." "No," Ethan replied, eyes steady on the road ahead. "Fort Sumner. That's where my grave is." The words settled like dust in the cabin. Claire's knuckles whitened around the strap of her purse. Mark chuckled reflexively, an adult's defense against the uncanny, but the sound rang hollow. "You mean Billy the kid's grave?" he asked after a moment. Ethan nodded once. "My grave." Mark exchanged a look with Claire, who mouthed silently, "What do we do?" She gave the faintest shrug. After months of strange names and night terrors, this felt like another test they hadn't studied for. "Let's just see what happens," Claire whispered. They veered off Interstate 40 onto a two-lane highway that threaded through endless sagebrush. The horizon stretched in every direction, a faded watercolor of sand and sky. As the miles rolled by, Ethan offered soft, matter-of-fact directions. "Take the next left at the old windmill. Keep right when you see the wooden bridge." Landmarks no child should know appeared exactly where he promised. A weather-beaten windmill creaked in the desert breeze. A rickety wooden bridge arched over a dry arroyo. Mark gripped the wheel tighter. 2 hours later, the first sun-bleached sign for Fort Sumner Historic Site emerged from the heat shimmer. Claire felt a chill despite the dry heat pressing through the windows. The historic cemetery was nearly empty when they arrived. A low adobe wall enclosed a scatter of graves, many marked only by crumbling headstones. Tourists usually came to see the memorial to Billy the Kid, though historians still debated whether his remains were truly there or lost elsewhere in the desert. A bronze plaque at the gate recounted the famous 1881 shootout with Sheriff Pat Garrett. Ethan hopped from the car before Mark killed the engine. He didn't ask for a map or look for a guide. Small boots kicking dust, he walked straight down a narrow path, past the official Billy the Kid headstone ringed by chain-link fencing. He never slowed. "Ethan, wait," Claire called, hurrying after him. The boy moved with uncanny purpose, weaving through leaning crosses and weathered markers. Finally, he stopped before a patch of bare earth shaded by a cottonwood, no marker. Only a half-sunken stone, its surface scarred by time. "This is it," he said, crouching to brush sand from the stone. "This is where I'm buried." Claire's breath caught. Mark looked around for a docent, certain they were about to be scolded for trampling private ground. But the cemetery was silent, except for the rustle of the cottonwood leaves. Ethan traced a finger across the stone's pitted surface. "See the letters?" "W.H. Bonney." The adults stared. To their eyes, the stone was nearly smooth, nothing but centuries of weathering. "I carved them myself," Ethan added softly. Mark crouched beside him, heart hammering. And there, so faint it could have been a trick of shadow, he saw a shallow groove forming a B. A second groove curved like an O. He swallowed hard. Claire whispered. No one told him that name. William H. Bonney had been Billy the Kid's real name, but it wasn't mentioned on the roadside plaque they'd passed. Mark was sure of it. A caretaker in a wide-brimmed hat approached from the far side of the cemetery, curiosity drawn by the sight of a small boy kneeling in the dirt. "Afternoon," he said, eyes narrowing kindly. "You folks looking for the kid's grave?" Before Mark could answer, Ethan spoke without looking up. "They buried me wrong. Should have been closer to the tree line. But Pat wanted it quick." The caretaker blinked. "That's an odd thing to say, son." Ethan finally met the man's gaze. "Pat didn't kill me the way they tell it." Silence settled again, broken only by a distant crow. The caretaker cleared his throat, clearly unnerved. "Well, the history's always been a little murky," he muttered. "People been arguing for 100 years where he's really buried." Claire felt her knees tremble. She pulled Mark aside. "How does he know about the arguments?" "We didn't even—" "I don't know," Mark whispered. "I just don't know." Ethan stood and began to wander toward the fence line, eyes scanning the horizon as though seeking something lost. He stopped abruptly, pointed toward a patch of earth beyond the official boundaries. "That's where the carving is," he said. "What carving?" Mark asked. "You'll see." They followed, stepping carefully over a low wire barrier. 50 yards out, among scattered stones, Ethan knelt and brushed away dry grass. Beneath lay a flat rock, etched with what looked like a crude star. Claire's breath caught when she noticed faint initials beside it. BTK, letters nearly invisible in the midday glare. Mark snapped photos, hands shaking. Later, when they compared the images to archived photographs of frontier symbols, a historian would confirm the star matched a design sometimes scratched onto possessions of Billy the Kid's gang. For now, the desert seemed to hold its own breath. The boy stood, dusting his hands. "That's enough," he said simply, as though closing a chapter. Back at the SUV, Ethan climbed into his seat without another word. Mark started the engine, the low rumble oddly comforting in the eerie quiet. Neither parent spoke for the first mile. Finally, Claire whispered, "We didn't tell him anything, nothing." Mark kept his eyes on the road. "I know." In the rearview mirror, Ethan gazed out the window at the receding cottonwood, expression unreadable. Part child, part something far older. They drove on through the shimmering desert, carrying a secret that no longer felt like imagination. The first proof was etched in stone and dust, and it would only be the beginning. The discovery at Fort Sumner refused to stay a family secret. Within a week, the photos Mark had taken, grainy images of a weathered stone and faint initials, circulated among friends and then across local message boards. Someone forwarded them to a regional history forum, and the story sprouted legs of its own. By the time the first reporter called the ward house, whispers of a child who found Billy the Kid's real grave were already echoing across New Mexico. Claire wanted to shut it all down. Mark, torn between fear and curiosity, agreed to a single interview with the Albuquerque Journal, hoping a straightforward account might quiet the rumor mill. Instead, it lit a fuse. Within days, producers from national outlets were leaving voicemails. A true crime podcast requested an on-air segment. Then came a call from a child development researcher at the University of New Mexico. Her name was Dr. Lena Vasquez, a clinical psychologist known for studying unusual memory phenomena in children. "I'm not here to sensationalize," she told Claire over the phone. "But cases like this are rare and worth examining. At the very least, we can help you understand what might be happening in Ethan's mind." After a long family discussion, the wards agreed to a private evaluation. The first session, Doctor. Vasquez greeted Ethan with an easy smile in a sunlit university playroom. She offered crayons, blocks, and a box of toy animals. Ethan ignored them and wandered to the window. "Do you know why you're here today?" she asked gently. "To talk about Billy," he replied, still watching the courtyard below. "Billy the Kid?" "No," he said, turning toward her. "Billy me." The session lasted an hour. Ethan described the night of July 14th, 1881, in startling detail. The creak of the old adobe house, the smell of gun oil, the sudden flash of light before a gunshot. He mentioned that Pat Garrett's boot scraped a loose floorboard, an obscure anecdote later verified in a little-known deposition from a deputy. Dr. Vasquez recorded every word. Afterward, she told Claire and Mark, "Children can absorb fragments of history and weave them into convincing narratives. But the specificity here is uncommon. Enter the historian's news of the boy's story reached Dr. Samuel Briggs, a Lincoln County historian who had spent decades sifting through conflicting records of Billy the Kid's death. He requested a meeting at the university. Briggs arrived with an armload of weathered maps and microfilm copies. He asked Ethan a series of rapid-fire questions. Names of lesser-known gang members, details of obscure robberies, the location of safe houses that never made it into mainstream biographies. Ethan answered calmly, occasionally correcting the historian's pronunciations. "It wasn't called Hargrove's Ranch back then," he said at one point. "We called it the Hargrove place, but it belonged to a man named Benavides before that." Briggs checked his notes. Sure enough, property records showed a Benavides family owning the land until 1879, an obscure fact buried in county ledgers. When the session ended, Briggs sat back, stunned. Either this child has spent years memorizing every disputed detail of Billy's life, he said quietly, or something far stranger is at play. The skeptics not. Everyone was convinced. Dr. Karen Laird, a cognitive scientist specializing in false memory, insisted that Ethan's accuracy proved nothing supernatural. "Memory is malleable," she said during a televised panel. "Children pick up cues from parents, from media they barely notice. The human brain fills gaps with astonishing creativity. This is a cultural story, not reincarnation." She pointed out that the Wards might be unconsciously feeding information to their son. Claire bristled but couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility. After all, she and Mark had done their own late-night research once the strange episodes began. Still, Dr. Laird admitted one puzzle, many of Ethan's most specific. Statements like the scraping floorboard and the Benavides name surfaced before the family ever searched historical documents. The media, swirl television crews began parking outside the Ward home. Bright lights flooded the quiet street as reporters shouted questions. Ethan handled it with eerie composure, offering few words beyond a single refrain. "I remember everything." One evening, a local news station aired an interview with an elderly rancher who claimed his great-grandfather once heard that Billy survived Pat Garrett's bullet and lived under an alias. "Maybe the kid's remembering because Billy never really died," the rancher mused. Theories multiplied. Reincarnation, souls recycling through time. Genetic memory, ancestral experiences encoded in DNA. Collective unconscious, a Jungian echo of the Old West imprinted on a receptive mind. Each explanation brought more questions than answers. Private doubts inside their home. The Wards wrestled with conflicting emotions. Mark kept meticulous notes of every conversation with experts, hoping to find a rational thread. Claire oscillated between protective instinct and creeping awe. At night she lay awake, replaying Ethan's calm recitations of a death more than a century old. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, she whispered to Mark, "What if this isn't about proof? What if it's about something we can't measure?" Mark stared at the ceiling, unsure whether the thought comforted or terrified him. A measured conclusion, for now weeks, turned into months of tests and interviews. Dr. Vasquez administered memory assessments designed to detect coaching or fantasy. Ethan's scores were exceptional but showed no signs of fabrication. "He believes every word," she reported. Whether that belief points to a past life or a rare cognitive gift remains unanswered. The academic paper she eventually drafted read like a cautious riddle. Anomalous autobiographical recall in early childhood. It drew no final conclusion, only the quiet admission that science could not yet explain every corner of human memory. Meanwhile, Ethan's calm insistence never wavered. When asked if he might be mistaken, he simply shook his head. "I was Billy, you can test everything. You'll see." The experts had tested plenty, and they had indeed seen, but none could say what it meant. The investigation left more mystery than clarity, and for the Wards it was only the beginning. Because Ethan's memories were about to turn from words into something tangible, evidence no skeptic could dismiss. The first dream came just after midnight, a sudden sharp cry that jolted Claire from sleep. She raced down the hallway to find Ethan sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open yet unfocused. His small body trembled as though he had been running for miles. "They're coming," he whispered, voice hoarse. "He's here with the shotgun." Claire reached for him, but Ethan flinched as if the room itself had turned dangerous. His gaze darted to the window, then the door. "Pat's boots, scraping the floor," he said, barely audible. "I smell the smoke." Mark appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Buddy, it's just a dream," he murmured, crouching beside the bed. Ethan shook his head violently. "Not a dream. It happened." The boy's pulse raced so fast Claire could feel it when she pulled him into her arms. She soothed him until the tremors eased. Yet when she tried to lay him back down, he whispered, "Don't let him shoot me again." For the next week, the nightmares came nightly. Each began the same way. A dark adobe room, moonlight through a single window, the slow creak of a floorboard, then the deafening blast of a shotgun. Ethan would wake gasping, describing the coppery tang of blood in the air, the smell of burnt gunpowder. By the third night, he added something new. "I dropped the coins," he murmured, half asleep. "They're still there, under the stone by the river." Claire exchanged a wary glance with Mark. "What coins?" she asked softly. "The ones I took from the safe," Ethan replied without opening his eyes. "Silver and gold. My hiding place, near the Pecos, under the flat stone shaped like a hat." When morning came, he remembered everything. Over cereal, he calmly repeated the details, adding that a rusted Colt revolver lay beside the coins. "It's still loaded," he said, as if reciting a grocery list. Mark tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but curiosity gnawed at him. Later that day, he pulled up historical maps of the Pecos River, cross-referencing with old accounts of Billy the Kid's final weeks. He found a small, long-forgotten bend in the river less than an hour from Fort Sumner. The old trail guides described a cluster of stones along the bank, one of which was famously flat and broad enough to serve as a camp table. Claire begged him not to pursue it. "We've let this go far enough," she said. "He's a child with vivid dreams, that's all." But when Ethan awoke the next night, with dirt under his fingernails, dirt he could not explain, Mark's resolve cracked. 2 days later, under a blazing New Mexico sun, they drove to the Pecos. Ethan guided them off the main road onto a narrow path lined with cottonwoods. He walked ahead with an eerie certainty, stopping at a wide slab of sandstone, half hidden by weeds. "Here," he said, dropping to his knees. "It's under here." Mark knelt beside him, feeling a surge of cold despite the heat. He pried at the stone's edge with a crowbar while Claire kept a tight grip on Ethan's shoulder. Beneath the rock lay a shallow hollow packed with dry soil. Mark dug with his hands until his fingers struck something hard. He pulled free a small leather pouch, brittle with age. Inside were 6 tarnished silver coins and a tiny revolver so corroded the barrel flaked at his touch. Claire gasped. "These could have been buried by anyone," Mark said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. Ethan looked up at him, eyes steady. "I told you," he said simply. That night they cleaned the coins enough to reveal mint dates from the late 1870s. The revolver, a Colt Lightning, matched weapons known to have circulated among Billy's gang. News of the discovery spread faster than the family could contain it. Local reporters swarmed the site, filming the weathered pouch and the blackened revolver. Historians debated authenticity, but even the most skeptical admitted the find was unusual. Ethan remained unfazed. "There's more," he told his parents after the reporters left. "The other gun. The letters. I hid them where the cottonwoods bend." Claire's stomach tightened. "We're not going back," she said firmly. Ethan met her gaze with unsettling calm. "Then someone else will." Over the next week, his visions grew sharper. He began sketching crude maps in crayon, trails through sagebrush, landmarks of rock and tree. Sometimes he'd wake screaming, clutching his chest as though feeling the impact of a bullet. Other times he spoke in a low, rasping voice that wasn't quite his own, mumbling about deputies and betrayal, about a promise to return for what was his. Mark recorded every word, a habit that had shifted from curiosity to quiet dread. Late one night, reviewing a recording, he noticed a faint sound beneath Ethan's voice, a slow, dragging footstep, as if someone were pacing the hall. Yet the hallway camera showed nothing. Claire began sleeping with the lights on. The family cat refused to enter Ethan's room. Objects moved, a chair angled differently, a window latch unlocked, that none of them remembered touching. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed to grow stronger. He carried himself with a strange confidence, his childish manner replaced by something older, almost defiant. "I have to finish what I started," he said one morning, staring out at the pale dawn. "They can't keep it hidden forever." Neither parent asked what it was. They weren't sure they wanted the answer, but the boy's next revelation would force them deeper into the riddle. His memories were no longer just visions of the past. They were instructions leading toward a place that history itself had forgotten. The morning after Ethan's latest nightmare, the desert seemed to call to him. He stood in the doorway before sunrise, bare feet on the cool tile, eyes fixed eastward as if he could see something beyond the horizon. "It's time," he said softly. "We have to follow the trail." Claire felt a chill run through her. "What trail, sweetheart?" "The one I used to ride when I needed to disappear," Ethan replied. "The path with the 3 cottonwoods that bend like praying hands. The other gun is waiting." Mark exchanged a glance with his wife. For days they had tried to convince themselves this was just a child's overactive imagination. Yet the revolver and coins found under the stone by the Pecos River were impossible to ignore. Now Ethan spoke with the same quiet authority he'd shown before that first discovery. By mid-morning they were driving north along Highway 84, the New Mexico sun already fierce. Ethan sat forward in his seat, scanning the landscape with a focus that belonged to someone far older. "Turn left," he said abruptly after an hour. "You'll see a dirt road by the windmill." Sure enough, a rusted windmill loomed just ahead, its vanes creaking in the dry wind. Mark turned onto the rutted track, dust billowing behind them. The road wound through endless scrub. After a mile, Ethan tapped the window. "Stop here." They stepped out into a silence broken only by cicadas. The land stretched in all directions, low hills, scattered mesquite, a faded sky. No sign of any trail. Ethan pointed toward a distant rise. "That way, 3 trees." Like hands they walked, heat pressing down. The boy never hesitated, his small boots crunching over rock and sand. After 20 minutes they reached a shallow arroyo where 3 cottonwoods grew at odd angles, their trunks twisted as though in mid-prayer. "This is it," Ethan said, voice firm. He crouched near the base of the central tree and brushed away layers of dry leaves. Beneath them lay a circle of stones forming a crude marker. Mark knelt beside him, heart pounding. He lifted the stones one by one until his fingers scraped something metallic. Together they cleared the earth, revealing a narrow cedar box sealed with a rusted clasp. Claire's breath caught. "Oh my God." Mark pried it open carefully. Inside rested a second revolver, better preserved than the first, and a packet of yellowed letters tied with twine. The air around them seemed to tighten. Ethan touched the revolver's grip with reverence. "That's mine," he whispered. Claire snatched her hand back from the box as though burned. "This isn't possible," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. Mark unfolded the top letter. The paper was brittle, but the handwriting clear. A looping scrawl addressed to "Dear Friend." The date read July 11th, 1881, 2 days before Billy the Kid's reported death. The letter spoke of a plan to escape to Mexico, of hidden money and loyal allies. It ended with a single chilling line. "If I don't return, remember the trail by the 3 cottonwoods." Mark read it twice, stunned. Historians had long debated rumors that Billy the Kid survived Pat Garrett's ambush and fled south. This letter seemed to feed the legend. As the sun dropped, they carried the box back to the car in silence. When Mark started the engine, the radio crackled, though it wasn't tuned to any station. A low, distorted voice slipped through the static, words too faint to understand. Ethan turned toward the sound and smiled faintly, as if hearing an old friend. That night they stopped at a small motel on the outskirts of Santa Rosa. Ethan sat cross-legged on the bed, studying the letters as if reacquainting himself with forgotten memories. "I buried these after the fight," he said quietly. "I didn't trust anyone, not even my gang." Claire sat beside him, searching his face for any sign of play acting. There was none. "Do you remember dying?" she asked before she could stop herself. Ethan looked away. "I remember the flash," he said. "The pain wasn't long, but I came back because the story wasn't finished." Mark felt the hair on his arms rise. He wanted to dismiss it, to say children repeat what they've overheard. But no one had mentioned the 3 cottonwoods or the hidden letters until today. The next morning, Mark photographed the revolver and letters, emailing images to a historian friend at the University of New Mexico. Within hours, the friend called back, voice electrified. "Where did you get these?" he demanded. "The handwriting matches verified samples of Billy's, and that model revolver. It's a Colt Thunderer, Billy's favorite. This could rewrite everything we know." News spread faster than they could contain it. A local television crew arrived by evening, eager for footage of the boy who had uncovered a possible lost chapter of Western history. Ethan tolerated their questions with eerie calm. When a reporter asked how he found the site, Ethan answered simply, "I never forgot." That night, the motel parking lot buzzed with satellite vans and flashing lights. Claire closed the curtains tight, but whispers of excitement and skepticism seeped through the thin walls. Mark sat awake long after Ethan had fallen asleep, staring at the cedar box on the dresser. Every rational part of him insisted there had to be an explanation. Coincidence, hidden cues, subconscious pattern recognition. And yet the evidence lay before him, real, solid, undeniable. Outside, the desert wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain and something older, almost metallic. Mark thought of the letters, the revolver, the calm certainty in his son's voice. The trail had led them to proof no one could explain, and something told him the path ahead would be even stranger. The following morning, the motel parking lot looked like the site of a political rally. Satellite dishes sprouted from vans, cables snaked across the asphalt, and a dozen reporters clutched microphones as if they were weapons. Bright camera lights turned the beige walls of the building into a flickering stage. Mark peeked through the curtain and let the fabric fall. "We can't stay here," he muttered. Claire pressed a hand to her forehead. Too late. They already know the room number. A knock rattled the door before she could finish the thought. A woman's voice, smooth and urgent, called through the wood. "Mr. and Mrs. Ward, I'm with Channel 7. We'd love a quick interview before the national crews arrive." Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, swinging his feet, calm as sunrise. "They want the story," he said simply. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. "This isn't a game," he whispered. By noon, the motel lobby had become a press center. Local anchors and national networks fought for space. Producers promised generous appearance fees. One cable host offered to charter a private jet to New York for an exclusive primetime interview. The Wards refused them all at first, but the attention only grew. Commentators debated the boy's claims on morning shows. Is he a reincarnated outlaw, or just a child with uncanny luck? Hashtags like "Down Billy the Kid Lives" and "Down Reborn Outlaw" trended within hours. Conspiracy forums exploded with theories, some claiming Ethan was a government plant to distract from political scandals, others insisting he was living proof of past lives. When the family finally agreed to a single controlled interview, live from a quiet conference room in Santa Rosa, they found themselves facing bright lights and a veteran journalist with a reassuring smile. "Ethan," the reporter began, leaning forward, "how did you know where to find those artifacts?" The boy shrugged, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. "I remembered," he said. "Remembered from what?" "From before." The journalist pressed gently, but Ethan's answers remained steady, unembellished. "I lived it. I buried the coins. I wrote the letters. I was Billy the Kid." The clip went viral within minutes. News sites replayed it on endless loop, each outlet framing the story differently. Boy genius unearths Old West relics. Child prodigy or paranormal proof. By evening, skeptics lined up to challenge every claim. A prominent historian told a late-night audience that the letters were clever forgeries, though he admitted he hadn't examined them firsthand. A child psychologist suggested that Ethan had unconsciously absorbed details from overheard adult conversations or obscure television documentaries. Children are sponges, she said. Given enough information, they can convince themselves of almost anything. Others weren't so sure. An archivist from Lincoln County examined high-resolution images of the letters and declared the ink and paper consistent with the 1880s. Forensic tests on the revolver confirmed it was authentic to the period and had not been buried recently. The tug-of-war between believers and doubters fueled the frenzy. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about the tiny outlaw with the big past, while serious commentators debated reincarnation versus cryptomeria. Paranormal investigators booked flights to New Mexico, eager to test the boy themselves. Inside the storm, the ward struggled to keep a grip on normal life. Claire stopped answering her phone. Mark quit checking email after hundreds of messages, offers, threats, demands, flooded his inbox. Paparazzi trailed their car. Strangers approached Ethan in grocery store aisles, asking him to predict lottery numbers or reveal the locations of other lost treasures. Through it all, Ethan remained eerily composed. One evening, as they drove back to their house in silence, he stared out the window at the fading light. "They don't understand," he said softly. Mark glanced at the rearview mirror. "Understand what, buddy?" "Why I came back," Ethan replied. His tone held no boast, only a quiet certainty that chilled both parents. The following week, the family accepted an invitation from a respected historical society to present the artifacts for independent examination. The society arranged for secure transport and expert analysis, promising transparency and neutrality. Cameras followed their every move as they entered the modest museum where the tests would be conducted. Before the experts could begin, Ethan walked past the display cases and stopped at a large sepia photograph of Lincoln County deputies. He pointed to a man in the corner, face half in shadow. "That's the one who betrayed me," he said, voice cold. "He told Pat where I'd be." The curator blinked. "This photograph isn't labeled," she said. "We don't know who that deputy was." That night, after hours of scrutiny, the society's preliminary report stunned everyone. The paper and ink of the letters matched the 1881 period, and the revolver's corrosion pattern indicated it had been underground for well over a century. They stopped short of declaring the items Billy the Kid's property, but called the find historically significant and deeply puzzling. News outlets seized on the phrase, "deeply puzzling." Headlines blared, "Experts stumped by boy's discovery," and "Science can't explain child outlaw case." Through it all, Ethan's calm never wavered. He seemed almost detached, as if the chaos outside had nothing to do with him. When a reporter shouted a question about what he would do next, he turned and offered a single, haunting sentence. "I have one more place to visit." The word spread across social media within minutes, sparking frantic speculation. Where would he go? What would he find? Mark felt his stomach tighten. He recognized the quiet resolve in his son's voice, the same certainty that had led them to the Pecos River and the 3 cottonwoods. Claire reached for Ethan's hand, but he was already looking past the crowd, eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the horizon, as if he were following a trail only he could see. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn, already dressed in his faded denim jacket and scuffed boots. He stood at the kitchen table, a small figure framed by the first grey light filtering through the blinds. "It's time for the test," he said quietly. Mark set down his coffee, uneasy. "What test, buddy?" "The one that proves I'm telling the truth." "The blood test." Claire's breath caught. They had avoided the subject for weeks, but after the museum's preliminary report, a genealogist from Santa Fe had suggested a DNA comparison. If Ethan shared even a distant genetic link to the Bonney family, Billy the Kid's birth name was Henry McCarty, it would not prove reincarnation, but it could eliminate coincidence. Claire had refused at first. The thought of her son's blood becoming a public spectacle felt wrong, but Ethan's calm insistence left little room for argument. "If we don't do it," he said, "they'll never stop." By mid-morning, they were on the road to Albuquerque, where a private laboratory had agreed to conduct the test under strict confidentiality. The drive stretched silent and tense. Outside, the desert rolled by in waves of ochre and sage. Ethan sat forward in his seat, eyes fixed on the horizon as though already miles ahead. At the lab, a technician swabbed the inside of Ethan's cheek while another took a small blood sample. The boy didn't flinch. "This won't hurt," the technician said with a reassuring smile. "I know," Ethan replied, voice even. They submitted a comparison against DNA from known descendants of the Bonney and McCarty lines, samples preserved in academic archives. The results would take several days, but the family barely made it back to their car before reporters swarmed, tipped off by someone inside. Cameras flashed, questions flew. Is this the reincarnated outlaw? Will science prove the impossible? That night, they checked into a discreet hotel outside town, hoping to stay hidden until the analysis was complete. Mark scrolled through endless commentary on his phone. Skeptics mocking them, believers celebrating Ethan as proof of life beyond death. Claire shut off the TV, unwilling to watch strangers debate their son's soul. Ethan seemed untouched by the noise. He sat cross-legged on the bed, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. "They can argue all they want," he murmured. "I already know who I am." 3 days later, the call came. The lab director's voice was careful, measured. "Mr. and Mrs. Ward, the results are interesting. There is a statistically significant genetic similarity between your son and the documented McCarty lineage. It's not a parent-child or even grandparent-level match, but it is far beyond random chance. From a genealogical perspective, he appears to share distant family ties with Billy the Kid." Claire's knees weakened. Mark gripped the phone tighter. "But it doesn't prove reincarnation," the director said quickly. "Genetics can't address that, but the connection is real." Word leaked within hours. News outlets erupted. DNA links boy to Billy the Kid's bloodline, blared across screens worldwide. Commentators scrambled to explain it. Perhaps Ethan's ancestors unknowingly intermarried with the McCarty family generations ago. Yet the improbability only deepened the mystery. Requests for interviews turned into demands. National networks offered six-figure deals for exclusives. Paranormal societies invited Ethan to headline conferences. A documentary crew camped outside the hotel, lights glaring through the curtains. Amid the chaos, Ethan remained serene. He spent long hours staring out the window at the mountains, whispering to himself words his parents could not catch. On the fourth night, he woke suddenly and walked to the balcony. The moon hung low and orange over the desert. Mark followed, worried, but stopped when Ethan raised a hand. "It's almost done," the boy said softly. "One more place to go." "Where?" Mark asked. "The jail." "The night I left." Mark knew instantly what he meant. The old Lincoln County jail where Billy the Kid had staged his legendary escape. The next day they drove south, tracing the same dusty highways once traveled by fugitives and sheriffs. As they neared the historic site, Ethan grew restless, tapping the window, eyes flicking toward the hills. Lincoln's old courthouse and jail stood preserved as a museum, weathered adobe walls glowing in the late afternoon sun. The curator, already alerted to their arrival by the ever-present press, agreed to a private after-hours tour. Inside, cool air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The corridors echoed with their footsteps. Ethan moved ahead without hesitation, guiding them past display cases of antique rifles and faded photographs. He stopped before a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bars. "This is it," he said. The curator nodded. "That cell is where Billy was held before his escape." Ethan reached for the latch, fingers tracing a groove in the metal. "I loosened this bolt," he said quietly. "Used a piece of wire from the mattress. Garrett never knew." Mark felt the hairs on his arms rise. The curator frowned. "That detail isn't in any public record," she said. Ethan crouched and pressed his small palm against a floorboard near the corner. "There's a gap here," he said. "I hid the wire under it when I left." The curator fetched a flashlight. Sure enough, beneath the worn plank lay a narrow crevice. Reaching in with tweezers, she drew out a thin, rusted piece of wire twisted into a crude tool. For a long moment, silence filled the corridor. The curator's face drained of color. "I've worked here 15 years, she whispered. "We've never found this." Ethan stood, expression calm but distant, as though a long-awaited circle had closed. Claire felt tears sting her eyes. "Ethan," she said gently, Are you ready to go home now?" The boy turned to her with a faint, wistful smile. Almost, he said. One more thing to finish. Outside, the press had gathered again, lights blazing against the deepening twilight. They shouted questions as the family emerged, but Ethan barely seemed to hear. He gazed back at the jail, eyes reflecting the moonlight, and whispered a final sentence only his parents caught. He knows I never really left. The words sent a quiet shiver through the night air. A promise or a warning no one could quite name. The night air over Lincoln felt heavy, a slow-moving blanket of dust and cold. A waxing moon lit the adobe buildings in silver, turning their edges sharp and strange. Claire tightened her coat as they walked the quiet street toward the courthouse. The town had mostly emptied after the day's media frenzy, but Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting cameras to emerge from the shadows. Ethan walked ahead of them, a lone figure in his too-big denim jacket. He didn't fidget or look around. He moved with the certainty of someone retracing steps he already knew. At the doorway of the old jail, he stopped and touched the weathered wood as if greeting an old friend. A caretaker had agreed to let them back in after hours. No reporters allowed. The key scraped in the lock, echoing through the courtyard. Inside, the air smelled of dry earth and rust. The caretaker stayed at the entrance, flashlight in hand, but said nothing. He seemed uneasy, as though sensing something just beyond his comprehension. Ethan turned down the corridor without waiting for guidance. "This way," he said, voice quiet but sure. His sneakers barely scuffed the worn floorboards. Claire's pulse quickened. "Ethan, honey, maybe we should—" "Mom," he interrupted gently. "It's all right." The cell door they'd visited earlier in the day loomed ahead. The curator's discovery of the hidden wire still hung between them, unspoken and unnerving. Tonight, the shadows made the room feel smaller. Moonlight slipped through the high window, striping the wall in pale bars. Ethan stepped inside and faced the far corner. "This is where it ended," he said. Where I knew Garrett was coming. Mark's throat tightened. "Ethan, you don't have to do this," but the boy's voice carried a strange calm. "It isn't for me. It's for him." He knelt and pressed his palm to the cold floor, eyes closed. The room grew silent except for the distant creak of settling wood. Then he began to speak, not as a child, but in a slow, measured cadence that belonged to someone older. "They thought I was asleep. But I heard the horses first, 2 of them. I kept the rifle by the window. I could smell the dust they kicked up." Claire felt the hair on her arms lift. She opened her mouth to stop him, but no sound came. "I knew Garrett would wait. I knew he'd try the side door. I almost stayed, almost waited for the fight." His eyes flicked to the door, pupils dark and unblinking. "But there was a promise I hadn't kept." He reached into his jacket pocket and drew out something small wrapped in cloth. Carefully he unrolled it, a tarnished silver coin, edges nicked with age. Mark's breath caught. "Where did you get that?" Ethan didn't answer. He placed the coin in the center of the room and whispered, "For the ones I left behind." A sudden draft swept through the corridor, rattling the iron bars. The caretaker muttered a startled oath, his flashlight beam trembling. The air smelled faintly of gunpowder, sharp and metallic, though no one had fired a shot. Ethan opened his eyes. They glinted with a light that wasn't just the moon. "He's here," he said softly. Claire grabbed Mark's hand. "Who's here?" "The sheriff. He's been following me a long time." From outside came the distant clatter of hooves, impossible in the modern street, yet unmistakable. The caretaker's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into shadow. Mark stepped forward, voice shaking. "Ethan, we're leaving, now." The boy didn't move. He turned slowly toward the door, gaze fixed on something unseen. "It's all right, Pa," he said, using a word he'd never used for Mark before. "It's just the finish." Then the sound came, a single loud crack like a rifle shot muffled by distance. The walls seemed to tremble. Claire gasped and clutched her son, but Ethan only stood straighter, eyes clear, as though some invisible weight had lifted from his shoulders. The air stilled. The smell of gunpowder faded. When the caretaker finally managed to relight his beam, the cell looked unchanged. Only the silver coin lay in the dust where Ethan had placed it. The boy swayed. Mark caught him, feeling the child's small frame shiver once before settling. "It's done," Ethan whispered, eyelids heavy. He's gone. Claire held him tight. We're going home, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. As they stepped outside, the night had grown eerily quiet. No reporters, no curious tourists, just the endless New Mexico sky and a sliver of moon. Far off, a lone coyote howled, a thin sound that rose and fell like a farewell. They reached their car without a word. Behind them, the courthouse loomed dark against the horizon. Mark glanced back once and swore he saw a figure in the upstairs window, a man in a broad-brimmed hat watching. But when he blinked, the shape was gone. Ethan slept the entire ride back to the hotel, his head against Claire's shoulder. He did not stir when they carried him to the room. Only as Mark laid him down did the boy murmur, barely audible, "No more running." Outside, the desert wind picked up, whispering through the mesquite and across the old adobe walls, a sound like footsteps fading into the past, carrying with them the final echo of a name that refused to die. The hotel room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the steady breathing of a boy finally sleeping without dreams. Morning light leaked through the curtains in thin bands of gold. Claire sat at the edge of the bed, watching Ethan's chest rise and fall. His small hands were folded beneath his chin, as if in prayer. For the first time in weeks, he looked like any other 7-year-old, no whisper of ghosts, no weight of history pressing down. Mark stood by the window, staring out at the desert. The world beyond the glass was the same one they'd driven through the day before, endless brown earth, a horizon smudged by heat. Yet something felt different. "Do you hear it?" he asked quietly. "Hear what?" Claire whispered. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point. It's like the night took everything with it." A few hours later, their phones began to buzz. Journalists, producers, podcasters. Word of their midnight visit to the Lincoln County Jail had leaked, despite their precautions. Someone had caught a glimpse of their car leaving after dark, and speculation bloomed across social media. Kid who claims to be Billy the Kid sneaks into jail. Hashtags multiplied. Pundits lined up to argue reincarnation versus elaborate hoax. They turned the phones face down. For once, none of it mattered. By afternoon, a historian from Santa Fe arrived uninvited, politely persistent. Dr. Alvarez was in his late 50s, neat beard, the cautious tone of a man who had spent a lifetime chasing legends. He asked for 15 minutes. Mark hesitated, but Claire nodded. Alvarez settled into the chair opposite Ethan, who had just woken. "I'm not here to test you," he said gently. "I only want to hear what you remember." Ethan tilted his head. "Not much today," he murmured. "It's like the pictures are fading." Alvarez watched him with professional curiosity. "Memories often do, especially the ones that feel borrowed." The boy frowned. "They weren't borrowed. They were mine, just old." Alvarez later told the parents he'd seen many cases of cryptomnesia, hidden memories surfacing from books or overheard stories. But he admitted the specificity of Ethan's knowledge remained baffling. "I can't prove or disprove what he's experienced," the historian said. "Some mysteries stay that way." Over the next weeks, life strained toward normal. Back home in Colorado, school resumed. Ethan joined a soccer league, rode his bike, laughed with friends. The wild intensity that had gripped him began to ebb. He no longer woke in the night shouting about gunfire. When reporters called, Mark politely declined. "We're done being a spectacle," he told them, yet small flashes surfaced. Once, during a thunderstorm, Ethan whispered, "Smells like the Pecos after a shootout," then blinked in confusion at his own words. Another time, he asked if they still had the silver coin from the jail. When Claire produced it, he smiled faintly but